On June 2, 1945, our division began loading into echelons at one of the stations near Prague-Rozhikany. There was very little rolling stock, wagons were given only for horses, and the guns were loaded with extreme density. The wagons were dismantled into small pieces. The personnel were placed mostly on platforms with the guns and partly with the horses. Our regimental headquarters, where I was now serving, was housed in a staff car and below it on a platform. The soldiers' telephone had already spread the rumour that the division was going to Moscow for the victory parade. One could believe this duck, considering that our division was the 1st Guards Red Banner Airborne, Order of Suvorov. With this faith we rode all the way to Moscow. We travelled through Czechoslovakia, Germany, Poland, short stops at some stations. We look at the passing towns and villages of Germany. The war did them almost no harm, not like the Soviet settlements. We stood in Dresden for a whole day, as the road was still functioning in a limited mode. We went to the city. It was literally all turned into a pile of stones, wiped off the face of the earth. The aviation of our allies, the Americans, worked here. There was no need for such barbaric bombing. The civilian population suffered. More than 100,000 died under the ruins. The whole point is that the city was part of the zone of occupation of our troops, and the American leadership, under a plausible pretext, destroyed everything that could have any benefit for the USSR. Residents, survivors of the bombing, cleared narrow paths of bricks, just to be able to pass. The nauseating odour of corpses decomposing in the rubble hung in the air. It was a sad picture, even though it was Germany, which we hated, and which brought incalculable disasters to our country, and such losses that even now, more than 50 years after the end of the war, cannot be calculated. Almost every year the figure of losses keeps increasing and increasing. Soon our echelon moved forward. The next day we drove through the territory of Poland. Here the war has rolled, so that its traces are visible everywhere. Stations, towns and many villages are destroyed. At the same time, we can't help noting that here, in Germany and Western Poland, peasants lived much better than we did in the USSR. It can be seen from the good buildings, not comparable with our shabby houses in villages, even where there was no war. Especially grievous picture was revealed to us in Belarus, where there was literally not a single railroad station, where the station buildings were not destroyed or burned. In many places in villages only chimneys stick out, people live in dugouts, surviving barns, half-destroyed houses. Everywhere one can see the traces of war. The ground is riddled with craters and trenches, broken equipment is lying around, rarely do you see a sown field. The ground is thickly strewn with mines, unexploded shells and bombs. Half-undressed and hungry children ask for something to eat. At short stops we share what we can. Here the road is functioning at full capacity, and our echelons are rushing with extreme speed to Moscow. About June 15th to 16th our echelon arrived in Moscow. Somewhere not far from Krasnaya Presnya we are standing by the echelon. On the neighbouring tracks, other echelons of our division, we are waiting for the command to unload, but there is no command. In the evening the rockets of the festive salute flashed over the city. Later, a few years later, when I was studying in Leningrad, I learned that it was a training for the victory parade, which took place on June 24th, 1945. We thought that the capital was celebrating some event, and we took a direct part in it. The soldiers poured out of the cars and opened such a festive salute from small arms, which the enemy obviously could not withstand. True, they all fired upwards, but we had no idea about blank cartridges and fired, of course, with live ammunition. The cannonade turned out to be suitable even by front concepts. The Moscow commandant's office was shocked by such fire support. Soon several cars with the commandant's outfit arrived at our station to calm down the echelons that were not too triumphant. We managed to pacify the soldiers. Not far from our stop there was a club, and a dance party started there. An old gramophone was playing, and a dozen or two girls were dancing. There were almost no boys, the war had killed them. Dancing was also a novelty for us. During the whole war, one and my other comrades had never seen anything like that, and many of us did not know how to dance. We went to the front as 17-year-old boys, not even having time to enter adulthood. We, a few officers, huddled aside. Besides, Our front outfit did not correspond to this situation. Dirty, worn-out uniforms, faces smoked in the echelons did not give us much confidence. But the Moscow girls obviously guessed who they were dealing with, and soon we took an active part in dancing, making intricate pretzels instead of dancing pirouettes. In general, having trampled many girls' feet with our soldiers' boots, we returned to the train, and early in the morning we were on our way. Evidently the Moscow authorities did not like our cannonade the night before. Our train was rushing eastward, and we were again lost in guesswork where to. We passed the Urals. There was no war here, but it was felt by the poverty and squalor of villages and stations, glimpsed along the railroad, crowds of people with knots. And our echelon is rushing almost without stops. We are approaching Omsk. It is almost our native land. I really wanted to visit home. It had been 4 years since I had left it. I talked about it with the chief of staff of the regiment. He advised to address to the regiment commander his car is on the neighbouring platform. I moved there and addressed my request to Lieutenant Colonel Lebedev, the commander of our regiment. He listened, looked at me, and asked, "And where are we going?" I replied that I didn't know. He said, "I don't know either. Where am I going to let you go?" Then he began to question me meticulously about what they had talked about at the Scouts training camp near Prague. I replied that I had taken an oath that I would not tell anyone what we had been told there. He replied that the war we were in was already over, and any secrets had lost their meaning. Anyway, I remembered that we were given the organization of the Japanese army at those training camps. I told him about it, as if unintentionally. He immediately jumped up and asked why I hadn't told him about it before. I replied that I had not given it much thought. I now realized that we were in a hurry to go east for a reason, and that we had not yet demobilized the older soldiers who should have been sent home long ago. We understood each other, although there was no direct talk of war with Japan. In general, the regiment commander allowed me to stop by home for 2 or 3 days, and then catch up with the train. Our echelon arrived in Omsk. There should be a short parking, brood horses, etc. I went to the station to find out how to get to Barnaul. There is a railroad from Omsk to Altai, and I hoped to get away. While I was at the station, our echelon, having shortened the parking lot, left for Novosibirsk. Other echelons, which went literally one after another, were pressed up. As it became known later, there were 2 fronts moving to the east, including ours, the 2nd Ukrainian, and it was hundreds of echelons. In general, I had to go to Novosibirsk, and when I arrived there, our echelon was no longer there. With difficulty, I arrived on the morning of the 3rd day on a freight train to the station Shipinovo, from which to the village Beloglazovo, where my parents lived, was 25 kilometers. It was early morning, the platform was empty. Only a man of small stature was walking by and looking at me. I also began to look at him, and suddenly I recognized my father. Surprise and joy with tears in my eyes cannot be described. After all, I left home before the war and have not seen any of my relatives since then. My father was taller than me then, and now it turned out that I was taller. I found out that he was going on a business trip to Barnaul. At that time, he was working as a chairman of the district consumer union. Of course, he postponed his business trip, and we went to Beloglazovo. My father had a horse and cart at the station, but we walked most of the way. I was interested to know the village news, and he about the events at the front. In general, we talked all the way to the village. I look at the village from above with excitement. It is located down in the floodplain of the Charish River. Although only 4 years have passed, the village has grown old and somehow dilapidated. War is war, and even here, thousands of kilometers away, it made itself felt. At home, of course, no one was expecting my arrival, and it was a complete surprise for everyone, especially for my mother, and tears and joy. I found out that there was almost no one left of my classmates. All died at the front. It is sad and sorrowful. Young guys, who did not have time to live, from the school bench went to the front in terrible battles. While we were talking at home, one of the sisters ran to Anna Sirigina, with whom we met a little before the war and then corresponded throughout the war. Soon she, joyful, came running to us. We were both happy and embarrassed, because we had not even had time to take a walk together, and although we corresponded, ineptly expressing our feelings for each other, but that was on paper. But here it was real, in front of everyone. Suddenly my father proposed marriage. I didn't expect such a turn of events. Still, I was going to war again, and I didn't even think of getting married. The front is the front, and anything can happen. It would be simply dishonourable to marry in such a situation. It could be that my wife, not having time to live married, would remain a widow. In this connection I said timidly at first that it was probably too early to get married. At the same time I had no right to tell the truth that I was going to the front. It would be a disclosure of military secrets, with all the ensuing consequences under the laws of wartime. Anyway, I agreed to get married. Literally the next day, it was June 24th, 1945, the day of the victory parade in Moscow, we went to the village council and registered the marriage. On the same day we had a very modest wedding. And in the morning we left, I went to the front, my wife to Barnaul, where she was studying at the pedagogical school. My father went on a business trip. My sister Lyudmila also went to Barnaul, to her husband, who was hospitalized there. So all together we went by train to Barnaul. There, at the station, I said goodbye to everyone, hardly hiding that I was going to the front. My condition was extremely depressed, not because the war was coming for 4 years, it had become a familiar thing, but because I might not see any more of my relatives and friends. I left the same day by the first freight train going towards Novosibirsk, and in the evening I was in Novosibirsk. I took a ticket for the first passing passenger train to the east, and I had ordered tickets for travel in an international class car. However, there were no such cars in this train, and there were no seats at all, so the ticket was composted to me without a seat at all. All carriages of the train are packed to capacity. Mostly our military brother is going those who have left the echelons for various reasons, vacationers catching up with their units, discharged from hospitals, etc. There was not only no place to sit in the cars, there was nowhere to stand. I could hardly squeeze into a vestibule and travelled there for several days. In order to sleep at least a little, we built something like shelves in the vestibule above. We found some scraps of boards somewhere at the stations, fixed them there, and 3 of us took turns to sleep there. We ate, as they say, whatever God sent us, mostly from the station markets. In the train restaurant the places were occupied all the time. Obviously people slept there at night. We passed Krasnoyarsk, Irkutsk, Chita. At Karinskaya station behind Chita I got off the train, because on the way I learned that our second Ukrainian front was being redeployed to Mongolia, and here in Karinskaya the echelons were turning south. I found an echelon of our division and moved on with it. At the very border with Mongolia, at Solovyevsk station, I saw my echelon moved and reported to the regiment commander. He was satisfied that I did not let him down and returned on time. Soon our echelon moved further south, into Mongolia, heading for the Mongolian station Bayan Tumen. All around, as far as the eye can see, stretches almost lifeless desert. All around is sand, not a tree, not a bush, not a single settlement. Once in a while a lonely yurt of a Mongolian shepherd with a flock of sheep can be seen in the distance. What they eat there, it is difficult to say. Only later, when I had to travel quite a lot through the desert in search of water, I learned that the sheep eat mainly thorns. It was July, when all the vegetation had already burned out under the merciless sun and turned into withered thorns. At the beginning of July 1945 our train arrived at Bayan Tumen station of the Mongolian People's Republic. Here we unloaded and set up our camp 20 kilometers east of the town of Choibalzan. Actually, it could be called a city with a big stretch. 2 or 3 two-storied wooden houses belonged to our army officers' house, military canteen, office, and I think the house of the Soviet consul. All other buildings were mud brick mazanki of Mongols and a few dozens of yurts, and that was the whole town. Around our camp there was bare sand and dunes. Somewhere in the sand we can see embrasures of concrete pillboxes built several years ago during the war with Japan on Kharkin Gol. We set up our camp near these pillboxes. Echelons of other regiments of the division are approaching. As it became known later, we became part of the Transbaikal Front, which was based on our Second Ukrainian Front. It was headed by its Commander-Marshal of the Soviet Union R. Y. Malinovsky. The front included MNR troops, mainly cavalry and units of the Transbaikal Military District, stationed here in MNR since the war on Kok in Gol. A few days passed, and our regiment in full strength concentrated in the local fortification. The heat is unbearable. During the day it is so hot that even in boots it is impossible to stand, it bakes the feet. It is especially difficult for the horses. The sun is merciless, and there is no shelter from it, and their hooves cannot stand the hot sand. There is not a bush or a tree anywhere. The pillboxes are almost completely covered with sand, the result of sandstorms. If there were some pillboxes cleared, they were as scorching as a bathhouse. The only coolness was at night, and then from sunrise to sunset the merciless sun. Not a cloud in the sky. All the days while we were standing here were sunny. Soon we received an order to reconnoitre the routes of advance to the Chinese border, which is not less than 200 kilometres away, and reconnaissance of the position area for deployment of the regiment in combat order. In one of the days early in the morning we leave by reconnaissance group headed by the regiment commander. There are practically no roads, but they are not needed. The sand has been so laid down for centuries that there is no need for a better road. We determine the azimuth of the direction and move along it, sometimes stopping and clarifying the direction of movement. There are still no trees, no bushes, no settlements around. Only occasionally a shepherd's yurt can be seen in the distance, and sometimes a local nomad rides by on his Mongolian. No landmarks, a blank sheet with terrain horizontals, and that's all. Livestock trails, somewhere marked on the map, are not visible on the terrain, yellow sand and dried grass everywhere. By the speedometer of the car we determine the past route. Somewhere not far away there should be the border with China, more precisely with the state of Manchukuo-go, created by Japanese occupants and actually controlled by them. No matter how much we looked at the area with binoculars, we could not see any signs of the border, although by distance we should have been close. Only in the evening we saw through binoculars, as in the distance, about 2 kilometers away, there rode on horseback a Japanese passing track, obviously a frontier one, so we are really on the border. Here we have to choose and tie the coordinates of observation points, determine and tie the positions of the regiment's batteries. There is a lot of work, and it is impossible to cope in a day, or even in 2 days. We stayed here for almost a week, while we fulfilled all the tasks. Now it is clear that there will be war with Japan. No matter how much we look into the terrain on the other side of the border, but we do not find any signs of Japanese troops or any fortifications. My scouts are watching all day and night with the help of stereo telescopes and binoculars, but they can't find any signs of enemy defences. Soon the parts of our division began to move to the position area. It is necessary to pass several hundred kilometres through the waterless, scorched desert. The heat is terrible, the sand is red hot, burning feet through the soles of boots. There are no means of transportation in the division. We have to walk, carry everything on ourselves, overcoat in a roll, a duffel bag with ammunition, grenades, dry rations. There is also a helmet, a bowler hat, simple soldiers' belongings. But in such heat, everything seems several times heavier. It is a little easier for our artillerymen. Each gun has 1 or 2 carts with shells and equipment, where they also put the soldiers' rolls and bags. One by one we manage to have a little rest on the wagon, but everyone gets it too. It is very difficult for the horses, and they have to carry the guns. When we were in the West, we took as many trophy horses as we could. They are large horses of some German breed, but they are not at all adapted for such conditions as we found ourselves in here in Mongolia. Our regular horses are much tougher, although they are not easy either. The trophy horses began to die one by one from heat and sunstroke. The soldiers protected them from the exhausting sun as best they could, taking off their shirts and putting them over the horses' heads to somehow protect the animals from sunstroke. By evening the heat subsides, but the stuffiness from the hot sand lasts almost the whole night. Only in the morning it is a little easier. I am painfully thirsty, everything dries up in my mouth, but there is no water. As soon as we stop for the night, the soldiers immediately start digging a well in the hope of getting water. Several hours of continuous labour, a deep hole is dug. Finally water of dark yellow colour appears. Impatiently we fill the first kettle. The soldier greedily falls to the life-giving and cool moisture. But We can't drink the water is bitter salty. Cursing everything in the world, the tired soldiers fall down on the damp sand. It is necessary to rest at least a little. With dawn the march will continue. Early in the morning, before the start of the movement, I was called by the regiment commander and given the task to find water and provide it to the regiment. For this purpose I was assigned 3 powerful trophy diesel engines, in the back of each a rubber container. Where to go, the regiment commander does not know. That's why you are a scout, to find and provide. On the provision of water depends on the regiment's fulfillment of the combat task and the life of horses, without which the regiment is unable to fulfill the combat task. 2/3 of the regiment's guns are horse-drawn. The task is difficult, but it is necessary to fulfill it. There is no information about a possible place where there may be water. It is only known that the engineering troops of the front should equip wells on the main routes of movement of the front troops. The width of the front stretches for many hundreds of kilometers. Where to look for these wells? I took my scouts and set off. There are no signs of water sources on the map. I estimated approximately where there are low places in comparison with the surrounding terrain and went forward with maximum speed. There is no need to choose a road in any direction. There is desert and dense sandy ground. I take an azimuth on the map. It is necessary to find my regiment in the boundless expanses of the Gobi Desert. Besides, it will also move forward to the Chinese border. For several hours we wheeled around the desert, but there was no result yet. Finally, with binoculars from a high hill, standing on the cab of the car, I see far away a group of cars, among which there are tanks. We rush there, and to our joy there was a well drilled by the engineering troops of the front. And there is water cold, slightly brackish, but quite suitable for drinking. We took a queue. We drink a lot of times, but we can't quench our thirst. Soon the containers are filled with water, and we rush back. Now we have to find the regiment, and it is not so easy. The tanks in the cars are open, and we have to drive carefully not to spill the precious moisture. By the middle of the day we caught up with the regiment. There is no limit to joy. Our cars were surrounded from all sides, but there must be order, otherwise we will spill more than drink. The norm is strict: 1 car for each division, half a litre for each in a kettle, and half a bucket for each horse. Not an hour later, we drank all the water, though it looked more like a warm slurry. As we rode along, the water heated up in the hot July sun, and a lot of dust from the wheels of cars got into the water. People still somehow understand that water is not enough, but the poor horses, having swallowed the warm water, look at their riders with pity, not understanding why in such a heat they got such a small portion of water. We managed to distribute water, have a snack, and then we were on our way again to the same place for water. For 2 days I carried water for the regiment. On the 3rd day, when the regiment's column was approaching the Japanese border, the regiment commander released me from the duties of water carrier, having entrusted the regimental logistics men to take care of this business, especially since it was their direct duty. At dawn on August 9th, 1945, our division, together with the whole front, crossed the border and began to develop the offensive towards the Big Hingan mountain range. It was still far away, and so far the same waterless, burned-out desert and merciless sun, scorching from early morning until the sunset. The enemy in our direction is not yet active. Ahead of the division operates our reinforced forward detachment, which includes a tank battalion. By the way, this battalion, when moving to the border, even before the declaration of war on Japan, without visible landmarks, jumped the border, went 30 kilometers deep into Japanese territory, and only the next day, having sorted out, returned back to the division. The forward detachment successfully accomplished the task, and we went forward unhindered. The heat was unbearable, and the command decided to conduct the offensive at night, and during the day to give rest to people and horses. At night it is relatively cool, and it is much easier to move than during the day, but at the same time in the second half of the night, by morning you want to sleep especially badly. Nights are dark, moonless. We take breaks only for 10-15 minutes to clarify the direction of movement. We don't make big breaks. People can fall asleep, fall behind and get lost. I was again given an assignment unrelated to my direct duties to accompany the battle flag of the division. The standard bearer, his assistants, and my reconnaissance platoon on horseback carry the banner. At night breaks, having posted guards, we fall to the ground and instantly fall asleep. My horse is tied to my leg with a bridle, it rests too. But as soon as the column starts, the horse pulls my leg quite strongly. I jump up and go forward again. In the morning, when the sun has already risen, we take a break for rest, having put out combat patrols in all directions. It is impossible to sleep under the scorching sun. We dig a trench for each of us, lie down on the bottom, and cover ourselves with a cloak tent. In the morning it is still bearable, and we manage to sleep for 2 hours, but then the ground heats up and it becomes stuffy in the trench, as in a steamy room. Besides, field mice, of which there are innumerable here, are annoying. They unceremoniously climb from all sides into the trench, crawl on the body, get under the clothes, and no measures against them do not help. I am thirsty, and thirst is a constant and heavy companion, but water is still only a glass a day, and not always. Sometimes it rains, and we try our best to collect rainwater. One morning we come to a rather large lake. The joy is immense. After many days of waterlessness, suddenly a whole lake, several kilometers long and almost a kilometer wide. Everyone rushed to the water with childish joy. Horses roared joyfully, rushing forward. We fall on the ground, falling to the life-giving moisture. Many fall directly into the water. But alas, the water is salty. True, it is not bitter salty, as before, but salty, though horses drink. Not holding back, we rinse our dried-up throats, drink the water, spit it out. Instantly everyone, both men and horses, which had already been harnessed from the gun carriages, were in the water. Shouts of joy, fountains of splashes, noise and noise spread throughout the desert. There are a lot of wild ducks, geese, some other waterfowl on the lake, who look with mute amazement at the spectacle never seen here before, flying from place to place away from people with fright. But there are tens of thousands of people, the birds stay in the middle of the lake. Soon machine gun, and then machine gun bursts are heard. The soldiers get duck and goose for breakfast. When they were swimming, they noticed that in the muddy water something was poking at their feet. Someone had the idea to use the camouflage net as a sign. The first trip ended with the fact that they could barely pull it out. Together with the grass, we got a lot of fish. The joy was immense. We immediately began to cook soup in cauldrons. There are already big piles of fish on the shore. We took our souls away from the fatty mutton. Here, in the boundless expanses of the Gobi Desert, there were many flocks of Japanese sheep. We did not see shepherds once. Obviously, they either ran away or hid somewhere. The sheep were herded by huge, fierce-looking dogs. They did not let anyone near the flock and did not allow the sheep to scatter. But at the first shots of our soldiers, they would run away. Each regiment chased many thousands of sheep, ishaks, camels, bulls. Having had enough of swimming, both men and horses rested. The rains had passed, and the heat was somewhat subdued. But it is necessary to continue the offensive. The Khingan Ridge is already visible ahead. Ulmi Mountains rise above the surrounding terrain for almost 2 kilometers. The sun is again scorching mercilessly. Our division is rather like Genghis Khan's army. Each battalion moves on its own kind of transportation. Some of them have camels harnessed to 2-wheeled nomadic kibbutz. Where they got them I do not know. Another battalion is on donkeys, the third on bulls. Cloak tents are stretched over the kibbutz, and soldiers hide in them from the exhausting sun. In general, a wild Tatar army. But the main thing, the task at hand, is solved. We continue the offensive. In one of the days on the way to Khingan, over our column, appeared our liaison plane U-2, Corn Plane, as we called it. Having seen the general's epaulettes of our division commander, who was riding on horseback, the plane made a landing nearby. The terrain was flat, and there were no problems with landing. Lieutenant General Afonin, our corps commander, jumped out of the plane. The division commander briefly reported the situation and the actions of the division. I am still with the division banner and guards and therefore hear the entire conversation between the two generals. When Afonin asked our commander Sobolov what problems, the latter reported that the division has no bread or breadcrumbs. The soldiers for several days have been eating only meat, mutton. Afonin, a man rough, cool, imperious, interrogated, "So you say, the people are hungry?" Sobolov confirmed it. Afonin, after thinking for a while, said, "Well, nothing. If they are hungry, then they will be meaner," got on the plane and left. When there was still a war with Germany, Afonin participated in the battles for Budapest, the capital of Hungary. There were very heavy battles, and Afonin was cut off several fingers on his hand by a shrapnel, and the other hand was missing fingers even earlier. But he refused to leave the battle and continued to lead the troops. The soldiers respected him. He was strict but fair. Soon from the sky again heard the murmur of an airplane. The same U-2, approaching our column, dropped to 10 meters, dropped a pennant, and then 2 bags of breadcrumbs. In the note Afonin's hand was written, "I send breadcrumbs, and don't say that the division is hungry." We laughed. For 10,000 people, 2 sacks of breadcrumbs, which in addition at the fall turned into crumbs, and a handful for each, is not enough. But still a care. In the evenings, when our Genghis Khan's army stopped for rest, the desert around for many kilometers was filled with the roar of camels, screaming of donkeys, mooing of bulls, neighing of horses, bleating of sheep, a real concert. The cattle are thirsty and hungry, but there is no water, and the food is only desert thorns. Here, in the foothills of the Kingun Mountains, sometimes there were herds of wild horses of small stature, with shaggy manes and tails, led by a ferocious leader, who led the herd and would not let anyone even at a close distance. Our soldiers repeatedly tried to catch at least a few wild horses to tame them and harness them. Their horses were already exhausted. A large carriage was made of wagons, like the letter P, and they tried to drive the wild herd into it. Sometimes they succeeded. Backup wagons closed the exit from the carriage, and the mounted soldiers tried to put a harness around the neck of the wild horse. Occasionally a young horse, usually a young one, would get caught in the noose. The rest of the herd fought back wildly with hoofs and teeth, and following the leader, making incredible leaps over the wagons, again went into the desert. This was repeated many times. The trapped horses struggled with everything they could, not giving into their hands. But in the end it was still possible to somehow tame them, and then the soldiers tried to tame them to the harness. Even in such harsh and difficult conditions, the soldiers did not lose their ingenuity and sense of humor. 2 soldiers rode on donkeys, tied their muzzles and tails with a rope. They put tents on their backs and a piece of board on them. They sit on it like on a bench, chattering their legs, talking animatedly about something and laughing heartily, not paying attention to the fact that we also laugh at their cleverness. During the night it rained quite heavily, and the bed of some river, which yesterday had no signs of water, turned into a rather turbulent stream. The soldiers crossed the river ford, but our heroes on donkeys did not want to undress, and they sat on horseback and rode on. In the water a stormy stream blew the donkeys apart, and the soldiers fell into the water, making everyone who watched this picture laugh. We are approaching the Big Hingan. The mountains are imposing, some peaks up to 2 kilometers high. The field road, on which we are moving, passes between 2 heights, forming as if a gateway to the mountains. Next to the road is a huge plywood shield, 20 meters long and 10 meters high. On the shield a huge green snake with 3 heads, on which our helmets with a star are painted with oil paint. Nearby stands a Japanese, and with one swing of his saber cuts off all 3 heads. The meaning of this masterpiece is clear. This is our front, advancing 3 armies in the first echelon. Soon the shield, set on fire by the soldiers, blazed brightly. I surrendered my banner authority and now minded my own business. With a platoon of reconnaissance on horseback we go ahead of the 2 or 3 kilometers. So far everything is calm. We carefully examine all suspicious places. Our regiment has 9 batteries, of which 6 batteries on Mektiaga, that is, on American Carr's Studebaker. They cannot pass here, so part of the regiment under the command of the deputy commander of the regiment, Major Gordichuk, along with other vehicles of the division, went the other way. Well, and we go directly in the given offensive strip on Kingun. There is practically no road. Sometimes there are trails, on which obviously cattle walk. The mountains around are sullen, bare, without trees. Not a single settlement can be seen anywhere. They seem lifeless, perhaps they are. The mountains are getting steeper and steeper. Our horses can hardly carry the guns. It is good that it is not so hot here as in the desert, but still we have to shed a lot of sweat climbing up the rocks. In some places there are sandy areas, but the sand is not as in the desert, where it is compressed and loose, and the gun sleds are very hard. The soldiers of the regiments pile on the wheels to help the horses. Sometimes for a day it is possible to pass no more than 10 to 12 kilometers. The enemy is still not visible. Obviously, the advanced detachment is knocking down the barriers. Only after the war one understood why there were no enemy defensive positions and a sufficient number of Japanese troops, as it was on the 1st and 2nd Far Eastern fronts, where our troops had to break through enemy defenses. The thing is that according to all military canons, the Gobi Desert, through which we were advancing, was considered impassable for troops, and it was indeed very difficult to move unbearable heat, waterlessness, lack of even a pathetic vegetation and settlements, etc. The Khingan Ridge also presented a very strong obstacle for the troops. There was also little water, no roads on which to move, no settlements, and, most importantly, in our direction there were known passes over mountain ranges. They had to be searched for. That's what I and my scouts were doing, of course solving my own reconnaissance tasks. Once we saw a settlement a little away from our route with binoculars. Taking precautions, we headed there. We could see a rather large and tall temple of typical Chinese architecture, curved roof slopes covered with red tiles, and around the temple Chinese mazanki, in Chinese fanzas. They are all made of clay, with flat earthen roofs. Taking precautions, we enter the village. It seems deserted, but soon a man came out of the pagoda. It is hard to tell at once whether it is a man or a woman. The man's face looks more like a woman's. His head is shaved naked. He is wearing a piece of maroon cloth, one end of which is thrown over his arm. The soldiers try to make contact with him, but he doesn't understand a word of Russian, and we don't understand a word of Chinese. In the West we found common ground quite quickly, especially in Czechoslovakia, but here we find no resemblance. Soon 2 or 3 more people came up, but they didn't understand anything either. The only word we managed to learn from the Chinese vocabulary is shango. It means something like approval, or even respect. That's the word our Chinese vocabulary was limited to. I realized that this was a men's monastery. I tried to enter the pagoda, not only by way of interest, but also to check. A Chinese monk, obviously among the superiors, mumbles something but does not let us in, showing us to take off our shoes. We complied with this requirement, but we are still not allowed in. With difficulty I realized that we should still put out matches. We enter the temple. Cool, dim light through small windows, huge yellow metal Buddha figure. We stand for a while and go outside. The soldiers are already satisfying their curiosity, unwinding some kind of monk. He looked more like a woman, so I wanted to know whether it was a man or a woman. The Chinese monk, not understanding what they wanted from him, was spinning after the uncoiled cloth and repeating the only word he obviously knew from the Russian language: I am a horse, a horse, a horse. The soldiers finally realized that he was really a horse and not a mare. For several days we've been climbing the mountains of Khingan. The enemy does not show itself. At last we crossed a rather high pass and started descending along the eastern side of the ridge. A green plain is seen ahead, fields are sown with ripening crops, some settlement is guessed in the distance. On the map it is marked as a small town. The terrain is a sharp contrast to that on the western side of Khingan. There it was a waterless and lifeless desert, hot sand. Here it was a green plain, well-groomed fields, settlements. The division's day camp is scheduled near this town. It is necessary to collect the stretched columns of regiments. We are in the very center of Japanese Manchukuo, and we can expect enemy resistance. The day is moving towards evening. It is much cooler here than it was in the desert. People are resting, horses and vehicles are resting. They drank enough water, laid down for the night, who could, of course, having organized a combat guard. The most impatient had already managed to visit the city, although in fact it is a large village. Quite a few Russians live here, descendants of white guards who fled to China during the Civil War. Many of the older generation, who directly participated in that war, are also alive. We are not interested in them, but their daughters, having missed the Russian soul, enjoy socializing with our guys. Although the commanders forbid such communication, but try to hold on to youth, and the dashing guys are not lost. A day later, the division continued the offensive. Our direction to the city of Mukden, the capital of Manchukuo. We are moving on a country road, although on the map it is marked as a highway. On the right and left there is a solid wall of corn and gaoliang crops. The height of the plants is often not less than 2 meters, or even more. Even sitting on horseback, it is impossible to see anything. I and my scouts go on horseback together with the vanguard. At times, noticing a village in the distance, we ride there through thickets of corn or sorghum. The fields are carefully tended. Not a single weed is seen anywhere. Sometimes we see Chinese people leaning and digging in their plantations. They are sometimes hard to see. They are dressed head to toe in homemade straw clothes, with a cone-shaped hat, also made of straw, on their heads. Attempts to find out anything are unsuccessful. The Chinese do not understand us, and we do not understand them. In the villages, the poverty is terrible. Naked, dirty and hungry children, immediately pouncing on us with outstretched hands, dirty motley pigs, more like dogs, scurrying around in search of food. In the streets are muddy, low earthen fanzas consisting as a rule of one room. There is almost no furniture or clothing, only broken mats. Under the clay roofs in the sun, in many of the fansa hangs some stinking offal, either pig or sheep. We learned that the Japanese were strict about the Chinese not slaughtering any animal for themselves without permission. The Japanese took everything, and the Chinese were allowed to take only a part of the giblets, and only those left by the occupants, otherwise they were threatened with severe reprisals. In general, the poverty is horrifying, especially if we take into account that before that we passed a number of European countries, where any village looked like a paradise in comparison with local villages. We continue our offensive. Judging by the map, there should be a small Chinese town Kailu ahead, but because of the high galen we can't see it, even sitting on horseback. Soon, however, the crops parted, and a town, or rather a high earthen wall, appeared ahead, from behind which the town could not even be seen. This wall enclosed the town on all sides. The road we were following passed through a massive brick gate. The opening was now bricked shut. As the advance party drew closer, 2 enemy machine guns rang out on either side of the gate. The battalion, making up the main forces of the advance party, lay down. A firefight ensued. I and my scouts quickly dismounted, took up an observation post and keep watch. Soon one of the self-propelled units attached to the forward detachment approached the gate. The enemy machine guns were silenced. The self-propelled vehicle stood for a minute or two and then turned sharply, hitting one of the columns of the gate with its rear end. Bricks sprinkled, and in the gate formed an opening into which the soldiers of the battalion rushed. Soon the opening was cleared and the self-propelled vehicle moved forward through the gate along the city street. After a short time, the entire advance party penetrated the town. The enemy evidently realized that resistance was futile and was rapidly withdrawing. The town looked more like a large village 1-story clay fanzas and occasionally squat brick houses. The Chinese population quickly assessed the situation, and in a few minutes a large number of vendors appeared on the street, hawking various vegetables. We had no time for shopping. The enemy could organize any mischief, and it was necessary to be on the alert. Soon we were on the opposite side of the city. Behind the city wall, the fields of tall gaoliang immediately began. The enemy did not reveal himself in any way. The Chinese could not give any clear information either, but only pointed their hands to the east, where the Japanese had gone. With the highest possible speed we headed east. There, on our way, there is the town of Tunliao. Judging by the map, it is much larger than the city of Kailu. There is a railroad going to Mukden, the goal of our offensive. By the evening of the next day we approached the town of Tunliao. In front of the town on our way is the Exiliaohi River. The width of the river in this place is about 100 meters. There are mountains nearby, and the river is quite fast and very muddy from the recent rains. The river is crossed by a single bridge, a reinforced concrete bridge on high piers. When our regiment approached, the bridge was already full of moving troop columns. approached the regiment commander Lieutenant Colonel I.P. Lebedev and Chief of Staff Major at Pugak. It was already completely dark, but the movement on the bridge did not stop. The regiment commander made a decision the regiment to stop for the night near the bridge, and at dawn to cross it in the hope that by then the movement will subside. As in the morning, while it was still dark, I went to the bridge with scouts. It's empty. I think that it is time for our regiment to cross it. However, looking closely, I see that there is no water under the bridge. I wipe my eyes, but the result is the same. I quickly walk across the bridge to the other end. It turned out that during the night the river had broken the dam on the other side of the bridge. I ran back, woke up the regiment commander, reported the situation. He was puzzled. We quickly go back to the bridge. There are already gathered several commanders and lively discuss the situation. To the bridge has already begun to pull up columns of cars, tanks, gun carriages, wagons, but the bridge does not work, and there is no other crossing. Perhaps, not without sabotage, but this is a matter of smersh. Riders on horses try to cross the river above the bridge. Some of them succeed, others fall into holes and go back. Soon the river is filled with soldiers and horses crossing it. The river is less than a meter deep in some places, but the current is strong. Soon a tank makes a successful attempt to cross the river. It is followed by another tank. In the middle of the river it suddenly stops, the water stream rushes around it, and the tank quickly sinks into the water. Literally in a few seconds it sank, and the crew barely had time to jump out. The crossing has stopped. Only people on foot and on horseback continued to wade across the river, cautiously passing the place where the tank went underwater. In 3 or 4 hours, large groups of Chinese, apparently mobilized by the command of our troops and local authorities, began to approach the bridge from the city side. Soon the river in the area of its breach through the dam was literally strewn with swarming Chinese and resembled a large anthill. Most of the Chinese had a bamboo pole on their shoulders, to the ends of which were tied baskets in which they poured soil, which was then dumped into the river stream in the area of the dam breach. We were skeptical about this idea, believing that it would hardly be possible to block the river in a week. But there is no other bridge. We must think how to move the regiment. Some people proposed to transport horse-drawn carriages and then to drag the guns on long ropes. But the ropes have to be found somewhere. The hope remains in the army engineers and their units. We have to wait. By evening, to our surprise, it turned out that the Chinese had manually blocked the place of the breakthrough, managed to dig a channel under the bridge, and in the darkness the river went under the bridge. Again. Now it was necessary to fill up the breach in the body of the dam and restore the road. The work did not stop at night and the next day. The traffic on the bridge was resumed. Such mishaps had evidently happened here before, which is why the bridge was restored in only 24 hours. The next day our regiment crossed to the opposite bank and concentrated on one of the outskirts of the city of Tunliao near the military airfield, where our military aviation was already based. The torrential rains of the previous day had flooded the low-lying areas of the terrain, almost all of it as far as could be seen. Dirt roads to Mukden, where we had to attack, were under a meter layer of water, and there were no paved roads at all. To conduct an offensive in such conditions was almost impossible not only for infantry and horse-drawn wheeled transport, but also for tanks. Nevertheless, the tankers of the 6th Tank Army, which acted together with our 53rd Panzer Army, found a way out. They moved to Mukden directly on the sleepers of the railroad embankment. In Mukden, meanwhile, an airborne force had been landed, which carried out a daring operation to capture Emperor Tsui of Manchukuo. He and his entourage were waiting for an American airplane to land to fly to Japan. The American-made Douglas airplane landed. Several military men, dressed in protective coveralls, got out of it, and when Tsui and his entourage got into the car and it took off, it turned out to be a Soviet airplane. True, the Emperor only found out about it in Khabarovsk. The Emperor awarded the commander of the landing party with an honorable cold weapon for the daring and brilliant operation to capture him. We stopped in Tunliao at the airfield, where the airplanes of the 12th Air Army, which supported the actions of the troops of our Transbaikal Front, were stationed. The next day, September 3rd, 1945, we received the news that Japan had signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender. World War II is over. However, for us it ended in a mundane way, and who was to rejoice but ourselves? The local population, as far as we could see, did not show any noticeable enthusiasm. Perhaps they had not yet understood and realized what had happened. In the evening we celebrated this most important event of world history with a gala dinner. All the officers of our regiment gathered in a large trophy tent instead of tables, hastily made shell crates, instead of seats the same, but lower, and that was all the furniture. And the table setting was not distinguished by refinement: walks, mugs, tin cans, soldiers' spoons, in short, everything that could be found by our rear men, who were in charge of the case. But it didn't matter to us. One toast followed another. Of course, we remembered those of our fellow soldiers who did not reach this frontier, who remained lying in the ground on the battle lines. They were not ashamed of the stingy tears of men. Soldiers were here, not far away, by battalions. It was impossible to gather them together, and we should remember that we were not guests, but in the deep Japanese rear, almost in the center of China, and there were many unkilled Japanese wandering in the fields, among whom there were fanatics kamikazes, ready for any adventure. Soon dozens of colorful rockets soared into the night sky, a spontaneous fireworks display to celebrate the victory. This was followed by such a salute from all kinds of weapons that I had never seen during the entire war. Small arms were fired: carbines, rifles, automatic rifles, machine guns. They were soon joined by shots from mortars. Aviation opened fire from airplane cannons and machine guns. Suddenly there was a powerful salvo of Katyusha in the darkness, and all this with live ammunition and shells. There were mountains nearby, and all shells, mines and bullets flew there. But the city felt the strength and power of our weapons. The regiment commander came out of the tent and called me. Together we went to calm the saluting soldiers and officers. We approached the nearest airplane. The regiment commander tapped a stick on the fuselage. In response, a line from the gun: "We go to the next," the same result. The commander waved his hand. It is useless to calm those who spent years at the front and now rejoices and salutes in honor of victory. In Tunyao we stood for more than a week. Somewhere at the end of September we received an order to transfer some of the personnel to other units, and the division to make a return march along the same route that we took here, and by the end of October to concentrate at the station Bayan Tumen, where to load into railroad trains to go to the homeland. In short, we were to return to the place where we had started the war with Japan. This prospect, of course, did not make us happy. Once again we had to move through the desert and across the Big Khingan Ridge. We began to prepare for a hard, long march through the desert, deserted and waterless. It was necessary to get food, fuel, forage for horses, etc. Food was partially procured at the expense of the trophy Japanese stocks in their warehouses. Forage was also filled from Japanese stocks. Well, for water supply for men and horses we had to rely only on what we could find in the desert. Perhaps the only consolation was that the heat was somewhat reduced. At night it became even cooler. We crossed the Big Khingan through the pass, along which there was a field road, and it was easier than when we came here, to the east. The heavy rains, which are quite frequent in the mountains, were annoying. So much water pours from the sky that the whole ground around becomes a huge puddle. I had a trophy German rubberized raincoat up to my heels. It helped no water got into the shins of my boots, but rather deep pockets of the cloak were always filled with water, and I had to pour it out often. We passed Khingan without any special incidents, and soon there was a dull, deserted desert Gobi without a single tree or bush. It stretches for many hundreds of kilometers, and we have to pass it again. Our business is a soldier's business. If we have to do it, we have to do it. We are walking through the desert in October. Often there is a strong headwind, so strong that it is difficult to sit on horseback. We have to dismount and walk next to each other, holding on to the stirrup of the saddle. The wind raises huge clouds of sand in the air. It is stuffed in the ears, eyes under the clothes, crunching on the teeth. It is difficult to breathe. We have to put a gas mask on our face. We tie the end of the corrugated tube with a bandage in 4 to 5 layers, and so we go almost the whole day, and still sand, or rather sand dust, gets under the mask. Large grains of sand, or rather small gravel drums, on my face. My poor horse walks with its head and body tilted forward, and even drags me. All the time I wipe her eyes and nostrils from the sand. At breaks, when lunch is handed out, the food squeaks on my teeth from the sand in it. No tricks to hide from it, at least for the time of lunch, do not help. Our column goes with the speed of a pedestrian. The daily passage is no more than 30 kilometers. Each regiment drives behind itself a large herd of sheep. There are also camels, Eshaks yawl cows, semi-wild horses. At one of the stops, the regiment commander gives me a task to count how many sheep there are in the regimental herd. I gathered my scouts. I determined the area of the flock for each of them, and we started counting. But soon it became dark, and the sheep were always running from place to place. In short, that evening we could not count them. They spent several more evenings counting. In the end, we determined an impressive figure, about 40,000, not counting a large number of different cattle that joined our flocks. The way back to Turbulent station in Mongolia lasted more than a month. We ate mutton exclusively. The cooks put so much meat in the cauldrons that it was not soup, but boiled mutton with a little water. The soldiers adapted to boil it, or rather, to fry it in cauldrons, at least some variety. But during the journey the mutton had become tiresome, and there was a limited amount of other foodstuffs. Water was also a problem, but not so acute. At times we came across wells drilled by our engineering units when we went to the east. Now they were very useful. Besides, quite frequent rains allowed the soldiers to replenish their flasks and all available containers. Monotonous riding on horseback from morning to evening for a month is tiring. The terrain is still desolate. There is nothing to catch the eye, only our columns stubbornly marching forward, seemingly endless and lifeless desert. Ordinary marching life. Early in the morning, with sunrise rise, breakfast at the field kitchen. All the same boiled fat mutton, sometimes some cereals and some water, and so 3 times a day and every day. It is so tiresome that it seems that I will never take it in my mouth again, but hiking fatigue and natural need for food take their toll, and at a halt we again go to the kitchen to get a portion of the same mutton. The scenery around us and along our way does not change much, the same desert expanses, with some small heights. Near one of them, marked on the map as the headquarters of Prince Arukorchin, we saw a large cluster of yurts of nomadic herders. This is already Mongolia. Nomads came here, as we later learned, for wintering. Our column stopped for another day. It is necessary to give rest to horses, and people are not less tired. It is necessary to examine the running gear of guns and wagons. The cattle, which we are driving behind us, also needs rest. After heavy rains, a small river, which flows here, has revived. It is of great importance for us we have to give enough water to our horses and cattle. For many days of the way it is necessary to wash, and wash something from our closet, because our shoelaces bend with difficulty. In general, we rest without a break. Everyone has enough to do. In the afternoon, we observe quite a colourful celebration of local nomads. It turned out that at this time they have wedding season, and several couples celebrate this event at once. We stand our camp aside, about 1 kilometre away, and do not interfere with the local people celebrating. Of course, there were quite a few of our soldiers who wanted, so to speak, to bring their colour into this holiday, but the political officers are on guard, and the patrols, specially posted near our camp, do not let anyone to the Mongols. However, the Mongols sent some of their Arats, who knew a little Russian, and invited them to visit us. There went a small delegation headed by the deputy commander of the regiment, on political part Lieutenant Colonel M.I. Olchala. As a gift to the newlyweds, they gave 10 to 15 sheep to each couple. That was the end of our communication. But from afar we watched the unusual for us wedding ritual, with binoculars and stereo telescopes till late evening. Having rested for 24 hours in the area of the Height Stavka of Prince Arukorchin, we moved forward again, towards the railway station Choibalsan. The second half of October 1945. Our column is approaching the final point of our route. A few more days of travel and we will be at the railway station, where we will have to board and load into echelons, and forward to the motherland. We are tired of travelling in foreign countries. And now we have another break for night rest. Evening comes quickly, the tired soldiers settle down right on the sand. There is no vegetation to build a simple soldier's bed. The gun crews have tarpaulins, and the soldiers lay down on it, putting under the head of whoever has what gas mask, saddle, duffel bag, etc. Officers are busy until late. It is necessary to check the presence and condition of the personnel, whether there are no sick. Laggards carefully examine each horse, whether the horseshoes are not lagged behind, whether the legs are not caught, whether there are no scuffs, whether they are fed and watered. Check the condition of equipment, i.e. guns, charging boxes, wagons and many other mundane details. The herd of cattle is located near the main bivouac. From there come guttural cries of camels, ishaks, bleating of sheep, mooing of cows, in general already familiar to us music of the camp. Here, too, there is enough to take care of. The cattle must be fed, watered, guarded so that they do not run away. I fulfill one or another task of the regiment commander and the chief of staff. Mostly I have to check how the above-mentioned activities are carried out in the units. Besides, I have a permanent assignment guarding the unit's battle flag. Late in the evening I lie down on one of the wagons to rest until morning. Covered with overcoat and cloak tent, I usually fall asleep quickly. Fatigue takes its toll. I wake up early in the morning, when the sun is still behind the horizon. Ahead is a new difficult day, and we need to check something else before the march. Soon we return to the same place from where we had moved east 3 months ago, against the Japanese Kwantung Army, or, as they used to say, against the samurai. Our front line and marching life ended there. Ahead was the loading into military echelons and the journey to the homeland. While we were waiting for railway trains, some of the soldiers and sergeants of older ages who had long ago, according to all articles and laws, reached the end of their service term, were demobilized and sent to the homeland by the first echelons. It was our turn to load into the train. We loaded quickly, and soon the locomotive pulled our train forward. We had to go to the Irkutsk region, the city of Nizhneudinsk, where the place of dislocation of our division was determined. From the station Choibalsan and to the station Karimskaya in Chita region, the railroad is single gauge, echelons moved one after another, with an interval of 2 to 3 kilometers. During the night, a wagon with a camp kitchen caught fire. The cook apparently fell asleep, and the raft with a wick, which was burning there, fell down. The flames quickly engulfed the entire wagon. The cook is rushing around the wagon, but there is nothing to extinguish. Our car is a staff car, and there is a telephone to call the duty officer on the train, who sits in the locomotive in the driver's box. I call. I report the fire. In the open door of the car you can see the neighbouring platform, on which stands a covered car, the booth of the artillery commander of the division, Colonel Jurievsky. Burning car next to his platform, and he has no connection. I wake up my comrade sleeping next to me, YF Mamishov. He is the regiment's chief of communications. I inform him that the wagon is on fire. He didn't understand anything at first, but then he asked, "Isn't ours on fire?" I answer that not yet. He pulls his overcoat over his head again and asks when ours catches fire, "Wake me up." The echelon stopped. We are trying to put out the fire, but it has already engulfed the whole car. The cook was burned, but alive. We quickly unhooked the cars. We managed to pull out the kitchen. It fell to the ground. By common efforts, we throw the burning wagon off the rails lying on its side. It continues to burn. We hitched up the wagons and set off again. The further way passed without accidents. In the morning, we crossed the state border. Hello, long-suffering motherland. In the first days of November 1945, our train arrived at the station Nijinsk of Irkutsk region. Peaceful life began, with its own problems. We have to get used to it. We had already forgotten for many years of war about this life, and for a long time we could not believe that there would be no shelling or bombing, that it was not necessary to go in attack, although of course training attacks soon had to be carried out, but this is not the front. Gradually we are being drawn into peaceful life. I also began the usual days of service in the regimental headquarters, in my former position the head of intelligence of the regiment. Soon my wife Anya, with whom we later travelled to garrisons and private apartments, came to me. We lived modestly. All the time was taken up by service, often had to be on exercises, on firing ranges in camps. But this does not belong to the front memories. My most cherished wish is that our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and future generations never knew the horrors of war, that none of them had to celebrate another day of victory. Let the war remain only in the memories of veterans. This is my dream. God willing, it will come true.